Good morning, everybody. How are you feeling? Some of you have come from different parts of the world, so you probably feel a little jet-lagged. I hope you've all had a good night, but when I came here out yesterday, I was really impressed by the scenery that you have chosen to have this event. And as I think, Jörg, you outlined, and Anke, it is a historical place, so I'm very glad to be here with you today, and I thank you for the opportunity that you give me to talk to you about branding at your workshop. And so for the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to engage you in a dialogue about the subject of branding and how that has been affected by some shifts that we see going around us in the world. Shifts, many of which have actually irreversibly changed the way we have to think about branding and, more importantly, the way we reach out to our audiences. Many of these shifts have been influenced by technology developments over the last 20 years, and they were quite far-reaching at the societal level. But I would argue, for those of you who like a little bit of history, the coming down of the Iron Curtain and the end of the Cold War, and the social, political, and economical rise of the BRIC countries have also contributed to those shifts. And thirdly, the globally interconnected world that we live in today, and that I think is very important to bear in mind, has brought upon us an empowered consumer like we have never seen before. And it is that consumer and all of you that are bringing increasingly challenges to organizations that can be probably described as paradigm shifts in business. So, what is a brand? You probably all have thoughts about this. You have already been given some definition this morning what a brand is. A brand, well, probably starts with a mark. A mark. Well, a mark doesn't mean anything unless we put it into context and we give it some direction so it can actually attract our awareness. Now, once it has our awareness, it probably should be attractive to keep us and to create maybe a preference. Maybe a brand is famous, but fame can be positive and negative. So maybe the best is a brand has both attractiveness and fame. Then it probably turns our awareness into preference. And I'm sure you're all exposed to this every day. We get brand signals, hundreds and thousands, and you know, some stick, some don't. But for sure, some of them are very old. And they have an endurance over hundreds of years. Some are very young and stand for a whole different set of values. Some are sometimes misinterpreted. This brand may have little to do with our consumer considerations. So, well, it depends what you have consumed and how much of it, then it may become relevant to you. But anyway, brands can stand for organizations. They can stand for products. So, I looked it up in the dictionary for you because I thought I would have to give you, as we're talking about a science, branding is a science, you have to start with a real definition. So, I looked it up in the American Marketing Association's dictionary, and what you read there is a brand is the name, term, design, symbol, or any other feature that identifies one seller's product distinct from those of other sellers. Now, for the purpose of this workshop, I'd like to offer you a different definition, a slightly more provocative one. A brand has actually nothing to do with a symbol, with a logo, with a product, with a service, or any of that. It has to do with the gut feeling, the person's gut feeling of a product, a service, an organization, or anything. Why the gut feeling? Because we are all human beings, and we're not rational beings. We are emotional. We are intuitive. And it's those gut feelings that we need to seek to understand and hopefully to influence so our brands become attractive and people want to engage with us. So, gut feeling. Now, what you just have seen on the previous chart was that many organizations, many products, by the way, those were the top 100 organizations. I'll just go back for a second. In the world, top most valuable brands in the world, Interestingly enough, this order hasn't changed in the top 10 for quite a while until this year. So it's already outdated. The number one most valuable brand, according to Interbrand, which is a global brand agency based in London, actually has now found out that Apple is the most valuable brand in the world. And number two is Google. So Coca-Cola and IBM been pushed back a little bit. We'll see how that evolves and develops going forward. The point of this chart, don't try to read it, is only one. Brands historically have been driven by products that companies have provided to us as consumers. And we often have developed a relationship with that product. We know the product, we know the name, we identify with it, but we often don't know the organization that stands behind it. I argue that that has actually changed. So these houses of brands have increasingly developed in what we call, and they put all their focus on that, like yourselves, by the way, into a branded house. So what does that mean? In the case of Unilever, which is a consumer goods company, they are now trying to provide a sustainable living plan to the individuals they engage with beyond the products they produce. Starbucks is providing an environment they draw people in to and provide, hopefully, a way of living beyond a cup of coffee. At least that's their aspiration. BMW is a company that tries to position itself way beyond the car, and actually its focus on mobility overall has helped the company to relaunch their motorbike business in the 70s and 80s last century very successfully. The company I have worked for more than 30 years has always based its existence on more than a computer. You may not know, but America would have never put the man on the moon without IBM. No airline today would fly without IBM. No bank would function without IBM. It is a company that has focused on the profound and significant challenges of this world and has actually repositioned its own brand around what they call Smarter Planet, solving the next problems that we will have and that we already have today. And BASF, we just heard it from Wolfgang. You stand for more than a chemical product. You stand for a sustainable, to read this properly, we create chemistry for a sustainable future. So what you see in all of this is it goes beyond the immediate impression of a product. It is long and enduring, what you try to really establish with a brand. So what all these companies have in common is that they base their enduring existence on what I call a corporate character. Now, what is that? A corporate character is based on some fundamental beliefs that you have as a human being, as an organization, on some values that you share, and a purpose that transcends way beyond the product, the service, or any kind of offering that you might have. And it's for that corporate character that you actually try to sign up advocates, like Wolfgang asks you to become advocates for your employer brand, and reach out to other constituencies and scale that brand through those relationships. Now, how do you scale a brand? Very important. The starting point is you must have a belief. But if you have a belief, that doesn't mean yet anything unless you can share that belief with others. So sharing that belief with others and convincing others to join you and start acting together with you on that shared belief will become and make you stronger. So you build confidence, people act on their beliefs together with you, and then comes the pivotal point. You need to reach out to other constituencies and really scale that effort. That is something that takes years. It's not done overnight, it's not done in months. You need to take yourself time to do that. But you have to stay focused on it and really base it on reaching out to others. So, for the purpose of the workshop, I thought I needed to at least give you a little bit of another perspective on brands. And that is, and I think Wolfgang, you already talked about this, the employee. Why is the employee so important, whether you work in a business to consumer or business to business business? Because it is the most important asset that a company and an organization, an institution has. And it is that motivated and inspired employee that is surrounded by probably some processes, but more importantly, the values of the organization they work for that create a distinct corporate culture. And that corporate culture, lived by every day in an authentic way, will create ultimately the brand that you can experience inside and outside the organization. So, companies today, by no accident, are refocusing all their energy on what you are all about, the employee, the most important asset of every brand. Now, what you see here is a little bit of a process, but just very briefly, what you see on the left side of the chart is actually in marketing a process that we have used for more than 100 years. It's called AIDA, forget it, you don't need to remember that. But it is a very sequential way of looking at how you build up awareness and then lead that to some kind of preference and a purchase decision, and hopefully a loyal one so that the buyer comes back. With the paradigm shifts that we have seen over the last couple of years, the last 20, 25 years, however, we have entered, as I said, a hyper-networked, real-time world of mass participation in product design, in development, in marketing and sales, in everything. Where, very important, trust and therefore any longer-term value creation is based and mediated increasingly through social interactions. And the scarce commodity in all that is the attention of the individual. So, what does that mean? That any meaningful brand like BASF has to base its long-term existence, its endurance, on some very careful thinking about what do you stand for? And we heard about the team strategy that you have and what BASF is all about in terms of its value system, how it wants to distinguish itself from the rest of the world, how it wants to engage, and most importantly, how it wants to be experienced in a consistent and coherent fashion. So, in IBM, where I worked, we talked to a lot of leaders around the world, and this is what you hear. In today's world, we are living in an environment which has become completely transparent. So the boundaries in which a culture is inside the organization and outside happens something else are over. Your company is completely transparent. Who you are is what you are and how you behave every day. Transparency. Consequence of that is people want to engage with you not as an anonymous organization, but they want to engage with you at an individual level. And so the control over a brand or the control over a company, if it ever has existed, it's definitely over. You are in the hands of those people out there. And they demand every day one important thing, and that is that you are authentic, that you are and behave what you want to be. Now, in that transparent world, I would argue that it, therefore, is absolutely, well, we talked about transparency, but it is impossible to segment a company's view of itself. So what is happening inside the organization and what you want to actually project to the outside needs to be one thing. You cannot separate that anymore like in the past. Therefore, it is not sufficient to communicate with our people, but you actually have to help them every day to live that authenticity, to make your organization as authentic as it needs to be. And that is easier said than done. I just talked about it. It's not a matter of months. It's a matter of years. And it is something that you have to stick with and do all the time so that they can really behave the way you want them to behave. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes, said 150 years ago by the then President Abraham Lincoln in the United States. And I think this quote expresses very nicely what we're talking about. It is as relevant today as it was then. Brands are all about authenticity. And, reputation is just something that you have today and that disappears tomorrow. You can actually build it up over years and you can lose it in a day or a week, particularly in today's world. But if you behave and act authentically, and even if you have a big problem, and I can imagine that a company like BASF has many of those exposures, as long as you are authentic, you will be able to recover. I'd like to give you an example of what we're really talking about. So, Catholic Church. Now I have to be careful. Religions is something that people think and feel about very differently, depending which religion you are adhering to. But the point of this chart is actually that when Francisco, the current Pope, came into power, I think he realized very quickly that the Catholic Church had an increasing gap between its aspiration and the actual behavior of many of its representatives and the organization at large. And I think he realized that that was the root cause for some of the decreasing popularity and credibility of that institution. So no surprise, I think, he has started to focus on fixing that and closing that gap and bringing aspirations again in line with the actual action. And I think that is something that will probably also take quite a long time, but it is clearly necessary, because if you aspire to change the world, you better have your own house in good order. So, I think what we're seeing with the Catholic Church is a major rebranding effort around that organization, and watch out, it will take some time. So we also talked to a lot of leaders around the world, and these are CEOs. IBM has been doing a study every other year ever since 2004 and has collected about 5,000 interviews with CEOs from organizations small and large and medium-sized around the world. And these are the 4 core mega trends that they see affecting their businesses. Of course, first one, globalization of value chains and the change in demographics. You all are very aware of that, and depending on the continent you work on, those can mean very different things to you. But the CEOs also talked about a whirlwind of new social media platforms that are really coming at their organization. So whether that is YouTube or Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or Renren, you name them, big challenge for organizations. Why? Because the new workforce is demanding a company to provide them with the same kind of environments that they live in outside the organization. Now you combine that with that trend about mobility, that explosion in mobile devices where everybody wants to bring their own device to work these days, you come to the most important trend on this chart, and that is the explosion of data. CEOs feel overwhelmed under the data that is coming at them. And that data, by the way, is not the real point. The point is, how do you distill what I call actionable insights from that data that you can act on? So when you look at this chart, this is the threat. The time period from 2010 to 2015, and we are almost there, the data that is growing most comes from the most messiest sources. So social media platforms, voice, audio, sensors, that's the data that is coming at enterprises. It's growing by a staggering of 800% in that time frame. And 80% of that data is uncertain. So unless your organization develops capabilities that can really distill, as I just said, insights from those data, you are left in dark. And this is the challenge for every brand. How do you collect meaningful data that you can act on? What does this all mean for our organizations and branding overall? First of all, I think we need to completely change marketing. Marketing has been a highly interruptive process where the audience has been bombarded in a non-participatory way with messages. And any progress in the relationship cycle has basically governed by the permission to do so. That has to stop, because the paradigm shifts that we have seen has brought us a world where people today are learning every day going out on the internet. They are self-directed learners. They don't need anybody. They learn all the time. And so unless you engage in a dialogue and provide some kind of understanding and value add to them, and I call this actually, a learning service that you need to provide and convert marketing to, you will not be able to keep them with you. So forget the interruption. You need to be participatory and engaging with them. So we need a new form of content in companies. How we think about content, how we design content, how we develop, how we use it, and how we measure it. Regardless whether that's an individual, an employee, or a third party, or a marketing team, content has to be something different. Content has to be a learning service. So forget company-specific content management systems, as I just said, that bombards people in an anonymous way where you don't even know whether the message sticks. What you have to move to is systems that really engage with people and help them, the individual, to improve their skills, their knowledge, hopefully about you, about your brand. And I would argue, only when we do that will we ourselves get the skills and insights that we need to move on. So unless you engage in this dialogue fashion with people, you will not be able to sustain your brand longer term anymore. So I want to finish up here by talking briefly about why social media is so important in this environment. When you talk about social media, you can think of it in two ways. You can either think of it as a channel, or you can think of it as individuals that are out there communicating with each other. Now, a channel usually is when, a BASF, for example, would put up a Facebook page. I don't know whether you have one. I have to say I didn't look it up, but with the branded name BASF in there. There may be many good reasons to do that, but I warn you, it could easily be perceived as another form of spam, because a channel is something very different than a network. A channel usually is some form of media that provides a value add, a content, maybe a service, but it interrupts its audience with a sponsored message. So we know radio, television, many of the channels that we know function that way. A network, however, is completely different. It's not linear. It's based on dialogue. People want to exchange a point of view, and if you pump a message in the traditional way we used to do into a network, you will annoy them. At best, they will ignore you. At worst, they will oppose your participation in the network. So, therefore, every company has to think through very carefully, where do I put most of my eggs? Where do I invest? And I would argue, based on the experience that I made at IBM, is that going the route and really focusing on the individual, on the employee, is probably the more sustainable and worthwhile one. So at IBM, to give you this little case study, we have spent 5 years of fruitful experimentation and actually encouraged our people through a very open blogging policy to go out and experiment. Go on YouTube, go on Facebook, go on LinkedIn. Everybody was encouraged to do that. And we had quite some, learning in doing so, I can tell you. But what was interesting is that very quickly, the social media activities of the IBMers developed from the periphery of the business to the core. What does that mean? People were not just going out there and doing their Facebook private stuff. They were starting to use networks as they were subject matter experts to connect with other subject matter experts. So we, as IBM, then realized we needed to do something to help them. And we focused on building for certain people. This was a very, a very sophisticated tiered program of enablement of helping them building their own digital identity and ability to go out there. So, in short, for example, we took every employee through a 45 minutes. The company has 450,000 employees. We took them all through a 15 minutes online course and really showed them all the issues, privacy, security, you name them, how you behave on networks. We then went on and picked some of the more sophisticated subject matter experts and gave them coaches. So today, the company has built around their social media activities of their employees a massive system of engagement. A massive system of engagement. And that is what I think will finally bring the fruit home. So to finish, what are some of the new realities? As I said, digital networks have made corporate culture indivisible from corporate reputation. What you are is who you are. You clearly have to focus on, who is influencing who. We still think as companies we can influence many, the many influence many more. Unless you build this network of advocates that I talked about that shares your belief, you won't get very far. Relationships are at the individual level. Everybody has the same tools. So control, forget it. You can't control things. You need to engage, you need to listen, and you need to react on that. And therefore, this sequential, very interruptive way of doing things has to be complemented, I would say, replaced by a very iterative and communication-based environment.